The air crackled with an energy Fort Chaffee had never known. It was Monday, March 24th, 1958, a day that would forever be etched in the annals of American history. Not for a war or a treaty, but for a haircut. At 6:30 a.m., Private Elvis Presley, serial number 53,310,761, stepped off the bus and onto the military base. And the world held its breath. He stood there, a young man of 23, but to millions, he was already a legend. Elvis, the king of rock and roll. His name alone conjured images of screaming fans, swiveling hips, and a voice that could shake the foundations of a church. Yet here he was, dressed in a borrowed suit, a pale green tweed, looking somewhat out of place amidst the olive-drab uniforms and the stern faces of the recruiting sergeants. His famous dark hair, thick and rebellious, glistened in the morning sun, a stark beacon of his individuality in a world where uniformity was the law. The moment he disembarked, chaos erupted. Flashbulbs popped like miniature explosions, blinding him momentarily. Reporters, dozens of them, surged forward, their microphones thrust out like spears shouting questions. "Elvis, how do you feel? Are you nervous? What about your music?" He managed a weary smile, a practiced gesture, but beneath it a storm brewed. He'd known this day was coming since he received his draft notice, had prepared for it, but nothing could truly ready you for the sheer magnitude of the public's obsession. He was no stranger to crowds, to the relentless gaze of the spotlight, but this was different. This wasn't a concert stage where he was in control, dictating the tempo, commanding the energy. Here he was a spectacle, an anomaly. He was Elvis the civilian, about to be swallowed whole by the military machine. And the first, most symbolic step of that transformation, everyone knew, was the haircut. Inside, Elvis felt a strange mix of emotions. There was the ever-present anxiety, a knot in his stomach that had tightened the moment he left Graceland. He was leaving behind everything familiar: his music, his family, his fame, his freedom. But there was also a quiet determination, a sense of purpose. He was doing his duty, just like countless other young men. He wanted to prove that he was more than just a flashy performer. He was an American citizen, willing to serve his country. He wanted to show them that Elvis Presley, the symbol, could also be Elvis Presley, the soldier. As he was escorted through the throng, past the curious glances of newly inducted privates and the stoic gazes of veteran officers, he tried to absorb it all. The barracks building stark and functional. Parade grounds vast and empty, save for a few distant figures, drilling the crisp, clean air that smelled of dust and discipline. It was all so new, so different from the velvet-draped stages and luxurious hotels he was used to. He caught a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface, perhaps a window, perhaps a polished door. His hair swept back with just a hint of a curl seemed to mock him. It was his signature, his identity. Generations of fans, particularly the young women, swooned over it. He'd spent countless hours perfecting its rebellious pompadour, using Vaseline and hair tonic to achieve that iconic look. Now it was a target. The Army didn't care about iconic looks. The Army cared about regulations. "All right." Presley, a gruff voice cut through his thoughts. Sergeant Barnes, a burly man with eyes that missed nothing, gestured towards a processing table. "Let's get you processed papers. Medical uniform issue." And then the sergeant paused, his gaze lingering on Elvis's hair, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Are the barber?" Elvis swallowed hard. The haircut wasn't just a physical change, it was a psychological one. It was the moment he would shed the last visible remnants of Elvis the star and begin his journey towards Private Presley. It was a public sacrifice, a ritual observed by the entire nation. He knew the photos would be plastered on every newspaper, shown on every television. He signed forms, answered questions about his medical history, and tried to focus on the routine. But the buzz, The whispers, the constant clicking of cameras from outside the windows made it impossible to ignore the extraordinary nature of his induction. He wasn't just joining the army. He was staging a play for the world, and the climax of that first act was rapidly approaching. He saw the other inductees younger than him, some visibly nervous, others trying to project an air of bravado. They stared at him, some with awe, others with what looked like resentment. He was aware of the unfairness of it. He was taking up so much space, so much attention, when they were all going through the same life-altering experience. He wished he could just blend in, but knew that was a pipe dream. As the morning wore on, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a dull ache of anticipation. He felt a strange sort of lightness, almost like a sense of surrender. There was no fighting it. He was here. This was his path now. And if shedding his iconic hairstyle was the first step towards becoming a true soldier, then so be it. He imagined the scissors, cold steel against his scalp. He pictured the clumps of hair falling to the floor, each strand a tiny piece of his past. It was going to be strange seeing himself without it. For years, his hair had been as much a part of his image as his voice. But then, a different thought took hold. What if this wasn't an ending, but a beginning? What if, stripping away the superficial, allowed something stronger, more authentic to emerge? What if beneath the carefully styled hair and the glittering suits, there was a man ready to stand on his own, to prove his worth not as an entertainer, but as a disciplined, capable individual? He looked out the window at the distant flagpole, the American flag snapping crisply in the breeze. A faint smile touched his lips. He was ready. Or at least he was going to try to be. The king was dead. Long live Private Presley. After what felt like an eternity of paperwork and medical examinations that probed every inch of his famous body, Elvis was finally directed to his barracks, Building 17, Room 3B. The walk felt surreal, a slow procession through a landscape he couldn't quite believe was real. The noise of the reporters had faded somewhat as he moved deeper into the base, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under army boots and the distant shouts of drill sergeants. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of his assigned barrack, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood floor polish and the faint, unmistakable smell of freshly laundered uniforms. It was a long rectangular room, lined on both sides with rows of bunk beds, each neatly made with crisp olive green blankets. Foot lockers sat at the foot of each bed, and wall lockers stood sentinel-like against the walls. It was stark functional, and utterly devoid of the personal touches he was accustomed to. A few heads snapped up as he entered. Most of the bunks were already occupied by other inductees, some sprawled out, others meticulously arranging their belongings. A hush fell over the room. It was like he'd walked onto a movie set and everyone had suddenly forgotten their lines. He found his assigned bunk, the lower one closest to the window. His footlocker and wall locker were already marked with his name and serial number. Taking a deep breath, he dropped a small duffel bag beside the bed. Well, look what the cat dragged in. A voice drawled from the bunk above him. Elvis looked up to see a young man with a mischievous glint in his eye and a shock of sandy brown hair. "Private Jenkins, reporting for duty, sir. Or should I say, Your Majesty?" A ripple of nervous laughter went through the barracks. Elvis managed a small, genuine smile. "Just Presley will do," he said, his voice a little softer than he intended. "Elvis, good to meet you, Jenkins." Jenkins swung himself down from the top bunk, extending a hand. "Likewise, Elvis heard you were coming. Thought it was just a rumor, you know, like Bigfoot. Or a quiet drill sergeant." Another laugh. This one, from the bunk across from him, where a muscular, serious-looking young man was polishing his boots to a mirror shine. "Private O'Malley," he said, not looking up. "Irish, and I don't believe in Bigfoot, and I don't believe in quiet drill sergeants, but I heard one last week," Jenkins retorted good-naturedly. "Must have been sick." Elvis felt a flicker of relief. These guys at least seemed grounded, not completely overwhelmed by his presence. He sat down on the edge of his bunk, testing the thin mattress. It was a far cry from the plush mattresses he was used to. So the king himself, O'Malley, finally looked up, his gaze steady and appraising. "Heard you got quite the reception outside. Guess we're all just regular Joes here, though." Elvis nodded slowly. "That's what I'm hoping for. To be a regular Joe," he meant it. He craved normalcy, even if just for a short while. Constant scrutiny, the demands of fame, had begun to weigh on him. He wanted to understand what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself, where his name didn't guarantee special treatment. "Well, you're about to get real regular," Jenkins said with a smirk, running a hand through his own already short hair. "Soon as they get those famous locks of yours." The reminder hung in the air, a silent elephant in the room. Elvis instinctively reached up and touched his hair, his fingers brushing against the familiar wave. It was still there, for now a last defiant flourish of his old life. "Yeah, I suppose so," Elvis said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Here, they were going to do it tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Lucky you," O'Malley grunted. "Most of us got it done the minute we signed our lives away. They want to make sure you know who's boss right off the bat." Elvis could feel the slight edge in O'Malley's voice, a hint of the resentment he'd sensed earlier. It was understandable. He was the exception, the one causing all the fuss, while they were just statistics. "I volunteered for this, you know," Elvis said quietly, looking at O'Malley. "I didn't try to get out of it, and I'm not looking for any special treatment." O'Malley held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Fair enough, Presley. Just understand, we're all in the same boat here. No fan clubs, no autographs, just soldiers." "Understood," Elvis replied, a genuine warmth spreading through him. This was exactly what he needed. Straight talk, no fuss. Another soldier, a tall, lanky kid with glasses named Miller, piped up from an adjacent bunk. "My sister's gonna be devastated when she sees your new do. Elvis, she's got your picture plastered all over her room." Elvis chuckled. "Tell her I'll still be singing, just maybe in a different key." The afternoon passed with introductions and attempts at fitting in. Elvis helped Miller untangle a stubbornly knotted bootlace, listened patiently as Jenkins recounted a hilarious, if slightly exaggerated, story about his hometown, and even managed to get a small smile out of O'Malley by discussing the merits of different types of boot polish. He found that if he just listened, if he wasn't Elvis Presley the star, but simply Elvis, a fellow inductee, walls began to come down. He learned about their lives before the Army. Jenkins was from a small farm in Oklahoma, itching for adventure. O'Malley was from a tough neighborhood in Chicago, joining to escape the dead-end life of the streets. Miller was a quiet bookworm who'd always wanted to serve, albeit with a slight fear of loud noises. They were a microcosm of America, united by a common purpose. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the barracks, a sergeant's voice boomed through the loudspeakers announcing lights out. The conversations dwindled, replaced by the rustle of blankets and the creak of bunk beds. Elvis lay on his cot, staring up at the bottom of Jenkins' bunk. The reality of his new life pressed in on him, the lack of privacy, the shared space, the rigid schedule. He thought about Graceland, about his music, about the roar of the crowd. He missed it already. A deep ache in his chest. But then he remembered the faces of Jenkins, O'Malley, and Miller, the tentative smiles, the shared camaraderie. He was still Elvis, yes, but he was also something else now. He was Private Presley. And tomorrow, with the snip of a barber's scissors, that transformation would become complete. He closed his eyes, a strange mix of apprehension and quiet anticipation filling him. Tomorrow, the king's crown would be shorn, and a soldier would truly begin to emerge. The first few days at Fort Chaffee were a blur of new sensations, strict routines, and the constant thrum of anticipation. Elvis, along with his bunkmates, was thrown headfirst into the basics of military life. Reveille at dawn, followed by a mad scramble to make beds and prepare for formation. Then came the drills, marching in precise lines, learning to salute, mastering the intricacies of military discipline. He found himself surprisingly adept at the physical challenges. His stage performances, with their demanding choreography and endless energy, had kept him in peak physical condition. He could keep up with the runs, push through the calisthenics, and endure the long hours of marching. What was harder was the mental adjustment, the constant orders, the lack of personal space, the feeling of being just one cog in a massive machine. During a particularly grueling drill session where they practiced marching in formation for what felt like hours under the stern gaze of their drill sergeant, Elvis felt a familiar ache in his legs. He glanced at Jenkins, who was sweating profusely but grinning gamely. O'Malley, as always, was a picture of stoic determination, his movements precise. Miller, though visibly struggling, pushed himself forward, his glasses fogged with exertion. "All right, Presley," Sergeant Barnes's voice boomed, cutting through the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravel. "Pick up the pace. You're dragging your feet like you're still on a stage." A few snickers rippled through the ranks. Elvis stiffened, then straightened his shoulders. He didn't want special treatment, and he certainly didn't want to be seen as a weak link. Pushed harder, his stride lengthening, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Later that evening, exhausted but strangely invigorated, Elvis sat on his bunk. Terry's posh. O'Malley, ever the perfectionist, watched him critically. "Panks," Elvis said, surprised by the compliment. He still felt a slight tension between them, a lingering sense of O'Malley's initial skepticism. Jenkins, meanwhile, was attempting to write a letter home, chewing on the end of his pen. "This army life ain't so bad, really, aside from the early mornings and the yelling and the blisters," he winked. "At least we get 3 squares a day." Miller, perched on his top bunk, was quietly reading a book. He was the observer of their little group, always taking things in. "It's about discipline," Miller murmured, not looking up. "And camaraderie? You learn to rely on each other." Elvis thought about that. Camaraderie. He was starting to feel it, a subtle thread weaving between him and these men. They were all going through the same thing, stripped of their former lives, united by a shared experience. Topic of the haircut, though unspoken, was always present like a shadow waiting to descend. Every now and then, a new inductee would arrive in the barracks shorn already, and the sight would serve as a silent reminder. Elvis's hair, still proudly waving, seemed to grow more conspicuous with each passing day. One evening after dinner, as they were winding down before lights out, Jenkins spoke up. "So Elvis' word is they're doing the big snip tomorrow. Is that true?" Elvis paused, running a hand through his hair. "That's what they told me tomorrow morning." He tried to keep his voice steady, but he felt a nervous flutter in his chest. Miller lowered his book, his glasses sliding down his nose. "It's a big deal, isn't it? For you. I mean, your hair." "Yeah," Elvis admitted, looking at his reflection in the small scratched mirror on his locker. His famous pompadour stared back defiant. "It's part of who I am, I guess. Or who I was." "But you don't look nervous," O'Malley observed, his dark eyes studying Elvis. "I am," Elvis confessed, meeting O'Malley's gaze. "A little? It's not just the hair, you know. It's like letting go of something. The last piece of the old life," he shrugged. "But it's got to happen. I want to be a soldier, and soldiers have short hair." Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, man. You'll still be Elvis. Just a bald Elvis." He laughed, and Elvis couldn't help but join in. "Or a regular Elvis," O'Malley corrected, a faint smile touching his lips. "That's what you said you wanted, didn't you?" "Yeah," Elvis said, looking at each of their faces. They understood. They didn't see him as a star to be gawked at, but as a fellow soldier embarking on a symbolic rite of passage. The barber shop had been a topic of hushed conversation among the recruits. It was more than just a place to get a trim. It was where identities were shed and new ones forged. They'd all gone through it, and now it was Elvis's turn on the world stage. He spent a few moments that night before he drifted off to sleep, thinking about the scissors He imagined the feel of the cold steel, the sound of the snips, the gentle tug as the barber worked. He wondered who the barber would be. Would they be nervous, excited, or just another professional doing their job? He hoped for the latter. He just wanted it to be over. He thought of the images that would be sent around the world. Elvis Presley, without his signature hair, it would be shocking to many. But to him, it was a necessary step. It was a commitment. He wasn't just playing a role. He was ready to exchange the velvet and the spotlights for the olive drab and the discipline. He was ready to trade his rock and roll identity for the uniform of a soldier. He closed his eyes, picturing the rows of bunk beds, the quiet breathing of his bunkmates. This was his new family for now. And tomorrow, they would witness his transformation, not into a different person, but into a different kind of person. A person who understood that sometimes shedding what you hold dear is the only way to truly grow. King was preparing for his final civilian performance, a quiet, personal one, right before the curtain truly rose. On Private Presley, Sergeant Yvonne Johnson had been cutting hair for over 30 years. First, as a young barber's apprentice in a small town in rural Georgia, then as a professional in a busy city shop, and for the last 15 years as the head barber at Fort Chaffee. His hands were gnarled, his fingers thick, but his touch was surprisingly delicate, his strokes precise. He had seen thousands of recruits sit in his chair, fresh-faced and nervous, leaving with a military standard cut, and a look of dawning realization in their eyes. He prided himself on his work, not just in the neatness of the cut, but in the respect he afforded each young man who entered his domain. The barber shop was his sanctuary. It was clean, efficient, and always smelled faintly of bay rum and rubbing alcohol. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air, and highlighting the worn linoleum floor. He knew every crack in the mirror, every subtle hum of the clippers. He was in the middle of giving a precise high and tight to a new inductee named Peterson when Corporal Miller, Sergeant Barnes's aide, walked in looking unusually flustered. Miller asked, his voice hushed, as if afraid the walls had ears. Yvonne nodded, finishing Peterson's neckline with a practiced flick of his wrist. "What is it, Corporal? Running low on shampoo again?" Miller leaned in close, lowering his voice further. "No, sir. It's about the haircut. They want you to do it." Yvonne paused, his clippers buzzing softly. The entire base, indeed the entire country, had been abuzz since Elvis Presley's induction. "Presley?" he asked, his voice flat. Miller nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, sir, Sergeant Barnes," said General Smith himself requested it. "You're the best, sir. They want it to be just right." Ivan grunted, turning back to Peterson. He dismissed the young private with a nod, then cleaned his clippers methodically. He wasn't flattered, he was wary. He'd avoided the celebrity circus so far he'd seen the newsreels read the papers. The whole world was watching this young man, waiting for him to conform. And Ivan, with his scissors and comb, was to be the instrument of that transformation. "When?" he asked, looking at Miller, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow morning, sir. First thing, they're going to set up cameras inside, apparently, and a dozen more outside. It's going to be a real spectacle." Ivan closed his eyes for a moment, a rare show of emotion. "Cameras," he scoffed. "This isn't a show, Corporal. It's a haircut. A military haircut. Yes, sir, I know, but it's Elvis Presley, sir." Miller's voice held an almost reverent tone. Ivan just shook his head. He remembered his own first Army haircut, decades ago. He'd been a fresh-faced recruit, scared and uncertain, desperate to prove himself. The barber, then a grizzled old-timer, had been gruff but efficient. He hadn't cared who Ivan was outside the military. He only cared about getting the job done. That's how Ivan believed it should be. No special treatment, no fanfare. Just discipline and duty. He spent the rest of the day preparing not just his tools, but himself. He sharpened his scissors to a razor's edge, polished his clippers until they gleamed, and laid out his combs and brushes. With meticulous precision, He even gave his barber chair an extra scrub. This wasn't about fame, it was about professionalism. It was about ensuring that when Elvis Presley sat in his chair, he would receive the same standard of care and respect as any other soldier. He thought about the kid. Elvis, he'd seen his face on magazine covers, heard his songs on the radio. He wasn't a fan of rock and roll personally, preferring the old blues and country tunes, but he couldn't deny the kid's appeal or the immense pressure he must be under. To give up everything to join the army, knowing every move would be scrutinized, Ivan felt a flicker of empathy. This haircut, he knew, was more than just a reduction in length. For Elvis, it was a symbolic shedding of his civilian identity, a public declaration of his commitment to military life. And for the army, it was a clear statement. Even the king wasn't above the rules. He decided then and there how he would approach it. He wouldn't be starstruck. He wouldn't treat Elvis like a celebrity. He would treat him like Private Presley, a young man who had volunteered to serve his country and who deserved the same professionalism and quiet dignity as any other soldier. That night, as he lay in his bunk in the quiet of his own quarters, Ivan reflected. He remembered a quote he'd once heard, something about how true strength isn't about what you gain, but what you're willing to give up. Elvis Presley was about to give up a lot, and Ivan, with his steady hands and sharp scissors, would be there to help him. Pictured the mop of dark hair, so famous, so recognizable. He knew it would be a challenge to cut it precisely, to create a neat regulation army cut from that wild abundance, but he was a master of his craft. He took pride in transforming raw recruits into respectable soldiers, one haircut at a time. He closed his eyes mentally, rehearsing the cuts, the angles, the smooth transitions. He imagined the quiet tension of the barbershop, the glare of the lights, the hushed whispers of the onlookers. He would block it all out. He would focus on the hair, on the head, in his hands, on the young man who for these few minutes would be entirely at his mercy. He would make sure that when Private Presley stood up from that chair, he would look like a soldier. And perhaps, Ivan thought with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, when it was all done, the young man would feel like one too. King was coming for his final civilian cut, and Sergeant Ivan Johnson was ready. The barracks buzzed with an unusual energy the next morning. It wasn't the usual pre-dawn scramble. It was something electric, charged with anticipation. The news had spread like wildfire. Today was the day. The king was getting his crown shorn. Elvis felt it too, a low hum of anxiety in his stomach. He'd barely slept, tossing and turning his mind, replaying conversations, imagining the glint of the scissors. He knew this wasn't just a haircut. It was a national event. The whole country was watching. As he dressed in his freshly issued uniform, still a bit stiff and unfamiliar, he caught a glimpse of himself in the small shared mirror. His hair seemed even darker, thicker, more prominent than usual. It was still the civilian Elvis looking back at him, the rock and roll star soon. That image would be gone. Jenkins tried to lighten the mood. "Don't worry, Elvis. They say a haircut can change your luck. Maybe you'll finally win big at poker tonight." O'Malley just grunted, polishing his already gleaming boots. "It's just hair, Presley. It'll grow back. Besides, you're here to be a soldier, not a fashion model." "I know," Elvis said, running a hand through his hair one last time. "It's just a lot of years of work, you know, and a lot of memories." He was talking about the hair. Yes, but also about everything it represented. His meteoric rise, the wild shows, the devotion of his fans. It was all tied up in that iconic look. Suddenly, the barracks door swung open and a flurry of activity erupted outside. Reporters, held back by military police, shouted questions, their cameras clicking incessantly. The flashes pulsed like strobe lights through the windows. Even Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was visible outside, his cigar bobbing as he spoke animatedly to a group of journalists. Elvis felt a surge of annoyance. He wanted this to be a private moment, a personal transformation, but nothing about his life was ever private. "They're really making a show of it," Miller whispered, his eyes wide. "They always do," Elvis sighed. He understood the marketing, the public interest. Colonel Parker thrived on it. But sometimes, Elvis just wanted to be a regular guy. And right now, more than anything, he wanted to be a regular soldier. Sergeant Barnes walked in, his face set. "All right, Presley, time to go. The barber is ready and the press is enthusiastic." He gave Elvis a look that said, "Don't cause a scene." Elvis nodded, straightened his uniform, and took a deep breath. His bunkmates offered quiet words of encouragement. "Good luck, Elvis. See you on the other side. Don't cry into your pillow tonight." That was Jenkins. As Elvis walked out of the barracks, the shouting intensified. He lowered his head slightly, trying to avoid the blinding flashes. He could hear questions about his manager, his career, his feelings about serving. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of his own footstep. He was escorted across the parade ground, the early morning chill biting at his cheek. The barber shop, a small, unassuming building, seemed to loom larger than life. He could see figures moving inside, setting up equipment. Lights, cameras. Of course. He hoped she'd be proud of him for serving, not just for his looks. As he approached the barbershop door, a wave of apprehension washed over him. This was it, the point of no return, but beneath the fear, a quiet resolve hardened. He wasn't doing this for the cameras or for his manager or for the public. He was doing it for himself. He was doing it because it was his duty and because he wanted to be the best soldier he could be. And that meant conforming to the rules, even if those rules meant sacrificing something so intrinsically tied to his identity. Paused outside the door, taking one last look at the sky, at the freedom of the open air. Then, with a squared jaw and a determined set to his shoulders, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The barber shop was brighter than he expected. Bathed in the harsh glow of Klieg lights, a handful of military personnel stood silently watching. In the center of the room, positioned directly under the brightest lights, was the classic barber's chair, its worn leather gleaming, and standing beside it, a comb in one hand, clippers in the other, was a man Elvis had never met before, but whose reputation now preceded him. Sergeant Evan Johnson. The sergeant was a stoic figure, his face lined with years, his eyes calm and steady. He didn't offer a greeting, just a quiet nod towards the chair. There was no fanfare, no special treatment, just the quiet professionalism of a man about to do his job. Elvis appreciated that. He walked over, took off his uniform cap, and settled into the chair. Felt surprisingly comfortable considering the circumstances. He looked up at Sergeant Johnson, who was now holding the clippers. Their quiet hum, a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. Elvis took a deep breath and met the sergeant's gaze. "Ready when you are, Sergeant," he said, his voice clearer, more resolute than he expected. He was ready to let go. He was ready to become Private Presley. Fully and completely, the transformation was about to begin. The air inside the barbershop was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable hum that seemed to amplify the quiet whir of the cameras and the muted clicks of flashbulbs. Elvis sat in the barber's chair, the crisp white sheet draped around his shoulders, feeling the weight of the world's gaze. He could see the reflection of the Klieg lights in the mirror blinding in their intensity, and beyond them the shadowy figures of officers and a few privileged photographers. Sergeant Evan Johnson stood over him, a silent, imposing presence. His face was a mask of professionalism, betraying no hint of nerves or awe or even amusement. He simply looked at Elvis's hair, assessing it as if it were just another head of hair in his 30 years of barbering. This calm demeanor was exactly what Elvis needed. No fuss, no drama, just a job to be done. "Good morning, Private Presley," Sergeant Johnson said, his voice deep and steady, devoid of any emotional inflection. "Standard military haircut, sir. Regulation." "Yes, Sergeant," Elvis replied, his voice a little raspy. He swallowed, then added, "Just do what you gotta do." Sergeant Johnson nodded, then picked up a wide-toothed comb. He ran it through Elvis's thick dark hair, separating the famous locks. Pulling them away from his scalp, Elvis felt a slight tug. A gentle resistance was a familiar feeling, one he associated with stylists preparing him for photo shoots or stage performances. But this time it was different. This wasn't about enhancing his image. It was about erasing it. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing his reflection just moments ago. The Elvis Presley the world knew. He remembered the feeling of his mother, Gladys, running her fingers through his hair when he was a boy, telling him how handsome he was. He remembered the countless hours spent in front of the mirror, shaping and perfecting his pompadour, making sure every strand was in place. This hair had been a symbol of rebellion, of youth, of rock and roll. It was part of the magic now. That magic was about to be clicked away. He opened his eyes, forcing himself to watch in the mirror. Sergeant Johnson picked up the clippers. The buzzing sound filled the small room, a mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the chair itself. It was the sound of change, of an era ending. The first pass was swift, decisive. Sergeant Johnson started low on the side, near Elvis's ear. A strip of dark hair several inches long fell away, landing softly on the white sheet. Elvis felt a jolt, a strange mix of shock and release. He watched the strand fall, a little piece of his past detaching itself, then another pass and another. Clippers moved with remarkable speed and precision, guided by Sergeant Johnson's experienced hands. Elvis watched, mesmerized, as more and more of his hair accumulated on the sheet, a dark halo around his head. Could hear the quiet clicks of the cameras, the hushed whispers of the onlookers, but they seemed distant, muted by the focus of the moment. It was just him and the barber, now engaged in a private ritual, despite the public spectacle. He felt a lightness starting to settle over him, not just physically as the weight of his hair lessened, but emotionally. Each snip, each falling strand felt like a burden being lifted. The expectations, the pressures, the constant need to be Elvis Presley, the star, they were all tied to that hair. Now with each swish of the clippers he was shedding them, becoming simpler, more focused. Sergeant Johnson didn't speak. He worked with methodical efficiency, his gaze fixed on Elvis's head. He shaped the sides, then moved to the back, creating a clean, crisp line. He occasionally paused, brushing away loose hairs with a small brush, inspecting his work with a critical eye, then continuing. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He was a craftsman, and this was his masterpiece rendered in military precision. Elvis felt the cool air against his scalp, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. His ears, previously hidden, now stood out. His face seemed to emerge more sharply, his jawline more defined. He no longer looked like the flamboyant rock star. He looked younger, more innocent perhaps. More like the boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, before the fame, before the frenzy. As the bulk of the hair was gone, Sergeant Johnson switched to scissors, meticulously trimming the top, blending the shorter sides with the remaining hair. He used a comb cutting against it, ensuring an even length. The soft snips were a gentler sound than the buzzing clippers, a more intimate sound. Signaling the finishing Teds. "Fine right." Sergeant John stepped back. "All right." "Private Presley," he said, his voice fording chorded. His famous locks were gone, replaced by a neat, short military cut. The pompadour was a distant memory. He looked like every other soldier on the base. He reached up, touching his newly shorn hair. It was prickly short against his fingertips. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He saw not the king of rock and roll, but a young man, earnest and determined, ready for his new life. "Thank you, Sergeant," Elvis said, his voice surprisingly strong. He meant it. Sergeant Johnson hadn't just cut his hair. He had facilitated a transformation. He had helped him take the first monumental step towards becoming the soldier he intended to be. The room, though still quiet, seemed to hum with a new energy. The cameras were still clicking, capturing every angle of his new look, but for Elvis, the show was over. The performance was done. He was no longer Elvis Presley, and it felt strangely, wonderfully liberating. The barbershop felt strangely quiet after the clippers. Fell silent. The air, once charged with anticipation, now held a sense of calm, almost a reverence. Elvis sat in the chair, the white sheet still draped around him, a silent sentinel to the transformation that had just occurred. His famous black hair, once a rebellious cascade, now lay in a dark, mournful pile on the pristine white sheet, a discarded crown. Sergeant Ivan Johnson stood back, his hands resting on his hips, surveying his work with a professional eye. There was no fanfare from him, no expression of triumph or relief, just the quiet satisfaction of a job. Expertly done. He treated Elvis's hair like any other, despite the glaring lights, the clicking cameras, and the weight of national expectation. He had been a barber, not a spectator. "All done, Private Presley," Sergeant Johnson said, his voice a steady rumble. He picked up a soft brush and gently swept away the loose hairs from Elvis's neck and shoulders, a delicate touch that belied his rough exterior. Elvis slowly raised his hand, his fingers tentatively exploring the newly shorn landscape of his scalp. It felt prickly, short, unfamiliar. The cool air on his scalp was a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He turned his head from side to side, feeling the almost weightless quality of his hair. He looked into the large mirror in front of him. Staring back was a reflection he barely recognized. The pompadour, the carefully sculpted wave, the sideburns that had launched 1,000 fan letters, all gone in their place was a neat regulation army haircut. His ears, once partially obscured, now stood out. His forehead seemed broader, his jawline more pronounced. He looked sharper. Younger, somehow stripped of the elaborate framing of his old style. He felt a profound shift within him. It wasn't just a physical change, it was a psychological one. For years, his hair had been a signature, a part of his stage persona, an extension of his identity as Elvis the King. Now, without it, he was just Elvis, just a man, just a soldier. And surprisingly, the feeling wasn't one of loss but of liberation. A quiet sigh escaped his lips. He knew the world would be shocked. Fans would mourn the loss of the iconic image. But here in the stillness of the barbershop, under the watchful but respectful gaze of Sergeant Johnson, Elvis felt lighter. He felt more aligned with his purpose. He was here to serve, and his haircut was the ultimate symbol of his commitment. "Thank you, Sergeant," Elvis said, his voice clear and earnest. He stood up from the chair, shaking out the white sheet as Sergeant Johnson helped him. The dark clumps of hair tumbled to the floor, where a young private quickly swept them into a small paper bag. Elvis saw a flicker of something in the private's eyes, awe, curiosity. But the private remained silent. As he walked towards the door, the small group of military personnel in the barbershop watched him. No one spoke, but Elvis felt a quiet sense of respect emanating from them. He hadn't made a fuss. He hadn't demanded special treatment. He had sat there calmly and allowed the transformation to happen. He stepped out of the barbershop and into the bright sunlight, carrying his uniform cap in his hand. The reporters were still there, a dense swarm beyond the ropes, shouting, clamoring for attention. The moment they saw him, a collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a renewed frenzy of clicks and flashes. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the money shot. Elvis, however, didn't flinch. He didn't try to hide his new look. He simply adjusted his cap and walked with a steady, purposeful stride. He was no longer the flamboyant performer. And in that moment, as he walked away from the barbershop, leaving behind the last vestiges of his rock and roll image, he felt a powerful sense of clarity. He thought of his bunkmates, of Jenkins, O'Malley, and Miller. They had seen him as a man beneath the fame. Now, he would truly look the part of a man among men, a soldier among soldiers. The playing field had been leveled. He was no longer the celebrity anomaly. He was one of them. The haircut wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was a profound rite of passage. It stripped away the external markers of his fame, forcing him to rely on his character, his discipline, and his willingness to serve. It was a visible sign to the world and to himself that he was serious. He wasn't here for a publicity stunt. He was here to be a soldier. As he walked back towards his barracks, the shouts of the reporters slowly fading behind him, Elvis felt a strange sense of peace. The king was dead. Long live Private Presley. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly, authentically himself. He had shed the gilded cage of fame, even if only for a while, and found a different kind of freedom in the anonymity of the uniform. He was ready for the next chapter. He was ready to learn, to serve, to truly belong. The walk back to the barracks felt different, not just the physical absence of his hair, but an emotional lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted. Elvis's scalp tingled slightly in the cool morning air. A novel sensation. Could feel the eyes on him, the curious, the impressed, the slightly bewildered, but he met their gazes with a new confidence. He was no longer trying to hide or conform. He simply was. Pushed open the door to Barracks 17, Room 3B, and stepped inside. The conversations instantly died. Heads snapped up. Jenkins, O'Malley, and Miller, who had been gathered around a deck of cards, looked up, their eyes widening. "Whoa," Jenkins breathed, dropping his cards. "You actually did it, man." Elvis managed to grin, running a hand over his short hair. "Told you I would." O'Malley slowly stood up, walking over to him. He circled Elvis, his eyes critically assessing the new haircut. "Well," he finally said, a small smile playing on his lips, "you look like a soldier. A real one." It was the highest compliment O'Malley could give. Elvis felt a warmth spread through him. "That's the idea," he said. Miller, ever the quiet one, just nodded, but his eyes held a look of genuine approval. "It suits you, Elvis. You look serious." For a moment, Elvis imagined his own fans seeing him like this. The screening girls, the boys who tried to mimic his pompadour. They would be shocked, maybe even disappointed. But he knew deep down that this was the right thing. This was necessary. Later that day, images of Elvis's haircut were plastered on every newspaper across the nation and shown on newsreels in cinemas. The headline shrieked, "Elvis gets GI haircut. The king is clipped. Pompadour gone." The world reacted with a mix of shock, amusement, and a strange sense of respect. It was a national event, a symbol of conformity, of a celebrity willingly shedding his star image for duty. Back in the barracks, life slowly resumed its normal rhythm, but with a subtle shift. Elvis was no longer just the famous anomaly. With his new haircut, he truly looked the part of a private, indistinguishable from the thousands of other young men around him, save for the lingering aura of his fame. But even that seemed to soften during lunch. He noticed fewer lingering stares. In formation, he felt less like a spectacle and more like a part of the unit. The other inductees, who had initially kept a respectful, almost fearful distance, now approached him more easily. They talked about drills, about the food, about their families back home. They saw him not as an untouchable star, but as a fellow recruit going through the same challenges. One evening, while cleaning their rifles, Jenkins nudged Elvis. "Heard my cousin back in Oklahoma almost cried when she saw your picture without the hair. Said it was the end of an era." "Tell her it's just the beginning of a new one." He felt no regret. The initial nervousness had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of calm. He found himself moving with a newfound ease, unburdened by the constant awareness of his public image. O'Malley, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "You know, Presley, a lot of guys would have tried to pull strings, get out of this, or at least get some fancy barber and a private room. You didn't. That speaks volumes." Elvis looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in O'Malley's voice. "I made a commitment," he said simply, "and I meant it." The new haircut, though a small change physically, had enormous symbolic weight. It signified his willingness to shed the superficial, to embrace the anonymity of military service, and to commit himself fully to his duties. It was a powerful statement to himself, to his fellow soldiers, and to the world. Elvis Presley was not just a performer. He was a patriot. He felt more focused now. The distractions of his fame seemed to recede, allowing him to concentrate on the demanding training. He listened intently during lectures, applied himself with diligence during drills, and pushed himself harder during physical exercises. He wanted to earn the respect of his superiors and his peers, not because of his name, but because of his effort. He looked in the small mirror above his bunk before going to sleep. His short hair, stark and practical, framed a face that looked tired, but also determined. He was no longer the flamboyant showman with the wild hair and the confident smirk. He was Private Presley, raw, real, and ready. And as he closed his eyes, a faint, genuine smile touched his lips. This new reflection, this new identity, felt right. It felt like coming home. With his new military haircut, Elvis Presley shed more than just his famous locks. He shed a layer of celebrity, allowing him to truly immerse himself in the life of a soldier. The initial flurry of media attention gradually subsided, replaced by the routine, disciplined rhythm of Fort Chaffee. He was no longer just Elvis the sensation. He was Private Presley, a member of Company A, just like everyone else. He threw himself into the training with a fervor that surprised even his drill sergeants. He learned how to field strip a rifle, navigate by compass, and march for miles under a scorching sun. He proved himself to be a quick learner and a willing participant, never complaining, always pushing. His physical stamina, owned by years of energetic performances, served him well during the grueling physical training. His bunkmates, Jenkins, O'Malley, and Miller, witnessed this transformation firsthand. The initial awe and skepticism they felt had been replaced by genuine camaraderie and respect. Elvis was no longer the king. He was their friend, their comrade in arms. One afternoon, during a break in an intense rifle training session, they sat under the shade of a sparse tree, wiping sweat from their brows. "Man, I don't know how you do it." Elvis Jenkins panted, his uniform soaked. "You just keep going. It's like you're powered by rock and roll." Elvis chuckled, taking a long swig from his canteen. "It's different, but it's not so different. On stage, you gotta give it your all. Or the crowd knows, here, you gotta give it your all. Or the sergeant knows. Or, worse, your buddies." He looked at O'Malley. "You gotta trust the guy next to you. He's right. You pick up the slack, Presley. I've seen it. You're not cutting corners." This praise, quiet and understated, meant more to Elvis than any roaring applause from a stadium. It was earned, not given. His natural charm, however, wasn't entirely suppressed. It simply found new outlets. During a particularly dreary evening in the mess hall with morale dipping, someone started humming a blues tune. Elvis, without thinking, joined in, his voice soft but resonant. Soon others joined in, and before long, the mess hall, usually a place of quiet, tired eating, transformed into an impromptu sing-along. He wasn't performing, he was simply sharing, connecting. Sergeant Barnes, walking by, paused, a flicker of a smile on his usually stern face. He didn't say anything, just listened for a moment, then continued on, leaving them to their music. It was a subtle acknowledgement, a recognition that even within the strict confines of military life, humanity and spirit could thrive. Elvis also found ways to use his fame for good. When a young private confessed to being homesick, Elvis sat with him for a while, sharing stories of his own struggles with being away from home, not as Elvis Presley, the star, but as Elvis, the fellow human being. He might have been a global icon, but he was also just a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who understood loneliness. He excelled in marksmanship, his focus keen, his hand steady. He impressed his superiors with his dedication and his willingness to learn. He wasn't seeking special treatment. He was seeking to be the best soldier he could be. And his haircut, short and unassuming, was a constant reminder of that commitment. It was a daily declaration. "I am here to serve." He learned the value of teamwork, of relying on others and having others rely on him. He shared late-night stories with Jenkins, received tough but fair advice from O'Malley, and even engaged Miller in quiet, thoughtful conversations about philosophy and life beyond the Army. They were no longer just bunkmates. They were a unit, a small, diverse family forged in the crucible of military training. As the weeks turned into a month, the image of the flamboyant rock and roll star with the wild hair slowly faded from the minds of those on base. They saw Private Presley, a dedicated, humble, and hard-working soldier. His fame was still there, an undeniable part of his identity, but it no longer defined his every interaction. He was finally truly just another soldier. He reflected on the haircut, Often it had been a cleansing. It had stripped away the superficial, leaving him with a clear vision of his purpose. He was here to serve his country, to learn discipline, and to grow as a man. And the barber, Sergeant Ivan Johnson, had been the silent, steady hand that had facilitated that crucial first step. The army wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, exhaustion, and homesickness. But there was also a profound sense of purpose, of belonging, of contributing to something larger than himself. He was building a new foundation, not on fame or adoration, but on duty, discipline, and the quiet respect of his fellow soldiers. He had found his stride, not as the king, but as a private, and it felt right. He felt like he was finally living a full, authentic life, one hair snip at a time. 2 years later, when Elvis Presley was honorably discharged from the Army on March 5, 1960, the national spotlight once again converged on him. He had served his country with distinction, reaching the rank of sergeant. He had proven to the world, and more importantly to himself, that he was more than just a fleeting sensation. But as he stepped out of his uniform and back into civilian clothes, the image that remained most potent in the public's memory, and in his own, was that of the young man sitting in Sergeant Johnson's chair. The Arnie haircut, that simple regulation snip, had become an indelible part of the Elvis Presley story. It wasn't just a moment of personal transformation. It was a powerful statement to a nation. In an era where celebrity was rapidly growing, Elvis had chosen duty over fame, proving that even the biggest star could be a regular citizen. Elvis often thought back to that morning in the barbershop. He remembered the quiet hum of the clippers, the gentle tug of the comb, the stoic professionalism of Sergeant Johnson. He remembered the feeling of lightness, of shedding not just hair but a persona. It was the moment he truly became Private Presley, a soldier among soldiers. He visited Fort Chaffee once, after his discharge, a quiet, unannounced visit. He made his way to the barber shop. It was still there, the same worn floor, the same sturdy chairs. Sergeant Ivan Johnson, now a little grayer still, stood behind the main chair, giving a fresh recruit his first military cut. Ivan looked up, his eyes still sharp, recognized Elvis immediately. There was no fanfare, no gushing, just a nod of recognition and a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Sergeant Johnson," Elvis said, extending his hand. "Good to see you." "Private Presley," Ivan replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Or should I say, Sergeant Presley now." Elvis chuckled. "Just Elvis will do, Sergeant. Wanted to thank you again for that first cut." Ivan just grunted. "Did my job, he did yours." He gestured around the shop, still cutting hair, still shaping soldiers. Elvis watched him work for a few minutes, the rhythmic snip of the scissors, the quiet concentration. He saw the respect in the young recruit's eyes, just as he had felt it that day. Sergeant Johnson wasn't just a barber. He was a gatekeeper, a silent guide in the journey from civilian to soldier. The haircut had set the tone for Elvis's entire military career. It taught him humility, discipline, and the value of being part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just a performer who happened to serve. He was a soldier who happened to be famous. That distinction forged in the barbershop defined his time in uniform. When he returned to civilian life, the fame was still immense, perhaps even greater than before. But something had changed within him. The confidence was still there, the charisma, the magnetic stage presence. There was also a newfound groundedness, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He was still the king, but he was also a man who had served his country, who understood the meaning of duty and sacrifice. His hair grew back, of course, eventually resuming its iconic style, perhaps a little more subdued, a little more mature, but the memory of that short military cut and what it represented remained. It was a powerful reminder that true identity isn't defined by outward appearances, but by character, by choices, and by the courage to embrace change. The story of Elvis Presley's first army haircut became a national event. Yes, but for Elvis himself, it was a personal crucible. It was the moment he shed his public skin and found a deeper, truer self beneath. It was the moment he became Private Presley, a uniform among uniforms, and in doing so became an even greater man. The barbershop, a humble space of transformation, had played its silent, vital role in shaping a legend, not just for the stage, but for life. And in the heart of that transformation was the simple, profound act of a single good snip